Men laugh when they believe numbers protect them. That's a truth I've observed across decades of living in a world where survival depends on understanding how people think. Groups create confidence. Numbers create arrogance. When you're surrounded by 15 men who think the same way you think, who share the same hatreds and the same certainties, the world starts to feel very simple. Very safe. Very much under control. Until someone walks in who doesn't belong. Someone alone. Someone who shouldn't be there. Someone who, by every calculation they've been taught to make, should be terrified. That someone was me. And they laughed when I walked in. 8 minutes later, no one was laughing anymore. But I'm not going to start at the beginning. Because the beginning doesn't matter as much as people think. What matters is the room. What happened inside it. And what 8 minutes of silence and calculation did to 15 men who believed they were untouchable. People ask me why I walked in alone. Why I didn't bring men. Why I didn't bring muscle, backup, insurance. Why a single black man would voluntarily enter a room full of KKK members without a single other person watching his back. The answer is simple. Bringing men would have been a response. Walking in alone was a statement. There's a difference. A response says, you threatened me, so I'm matching your threat. It puts you on equal footing. It turns the situation into a competition of resources. How many men do you have versus how many do I have? Who has more weapons? Who can outspend the other in violence? A statement says something entirely different. It says, you are not worth my fear. That message, delivered by my presence alone, by the simple act of walking into that room without backup, was more powerful than anything I could have said with words. Because words can be dismissed. Words can be argued with. Words require the other side to listen. But a black man walking alone into a room full of KKK members? That required no words at all. It demanded attention. It demanded thought. It demanded, whether they wanted to or not, the question, why isn't he afraid? And that question, once it enters someone's mind, is very difficult to remove. The room was in the basement of a building in Lower Manhattan. Not Harlem. They'd chosen the location specifically because it was away from my territory. Away from the streets where I operated. Away from the people who might intervene or even notice. They thought distance was protection. They thought meeting somewhere I wasn't expected gave them an advantage. It gave me one instead. When I walked down those stairs, the room was already in full swing. 15 men. Some in civilian clothes. Some not bothering to hide what they were. Sitting, standing, drinking, talking loudly. The confidence of people who'd never been seriously challenged. Who'd operated for years with the assumption that nobody would dare confront them directly. They were gathered because of something specific. A plan they'd been developing. Something they intended to do in Harlem. Something they believed would send a message about who controlled what. About where certain people belonged and where they didn't. I knew about the plan. That's why I was there. Not to negotiate. Not to beg them to stop. To make them understand that proceeding with it would be the worst decision they'd ever make. The room went quiet for about half a second when I appeared at the bottom of the stairs. Then someone laughed. A short, sharp sound. And the laughter spread. Because to them, my presence was absurd. One man. One black man. In their space. Without backup. Without weapons visible. Without any apparent reason to feel anything other than afraid. The laughter was loud. Confident. Completely sure of itself. I let it happen. Didn't interrupt it. Didn't react to it. Just stood there at the bottom of the stairs, hands visible, posture relaxed, and let them laugh until they were done. Because laughter that loud usually means something underneath it. Usually means a question that hasn't been asked yet is starting to form. Here's what I understood about organized hatred. About groups like the one in that room. They operate on a shared belief system. A shared understanding of how the world works. Who is powerful and who isn't. Who is dangerous and who is harmless. That belief system is their foundation. Everything they do, the intimidation, the violence, the rituals, the gathering, is built on top of it. And it works. It works because most people they encounter confirm the belief. Most people they intimidate react the way the belief predicts. With fear. With submission. With retreat. But belief systems are fragile things. They stay intact as long as reality supports them. The moment reality contradicts them, the moment someone behaves in a way the belief doesn't predict, cracks start to form. I was there to create cracks. Not through violence. Not through threats. Through the simple, undeniable fact of my presence. Of my calm. Of my refusal to behave the way their entire worldview told them I should behave. They expected fear. I gave them something they had no framework for understanding. That's more unsettling than any weapon. The man who seemed to be leading the group, older, gray at the temples, the kind of face that had seen decades of this work, was the first to stop laughing. He looked at me with genuine curiosity. Not anger. Not fear. Curiosity. Because I didn't fit the pattern he'd been operating within his entire life. You lost? He asked. The room laughed again, quieter this time. Waiting for my response. I didn't answer immediately. Let the silence stretch. Let it fill the space where a response was expected. Because silence in a room like that, in a moment like that, is its own form of communication. It says, I'm not performing for you. I'm not here to give you the satisfaction of a reaction. Then I spoke, quietly. Not softly, there's a difference. Softly implies uncertainty. Quietly implies control. I'm exactly where I need to be, I said. The room shifted. Barely. But I felt it. The confidence hadn't broken yet, but it had been questioned. For the first time in what might have been a long time, 15 men in that room were all asking the same question. What does this man know that we don't? The next few minutes were the most important of my life. Not because of what I did. Because of what I didn't do. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't threaten. Didn't posture. Didn't try to match their energy or their aggression. I just existed in that room. Calmly. Deliberately. Like I belonged there more than they did. And I started talking. Not about them. Not about what they'd planned. Not about Harlem or territory or power. I talked about consequences. Abstract at first. General principles about how decisions ripple outward. How actions create reactions that can't always be predicted or controlled. How men who make plans without understanding the full scope of what those plans will trigger often find themselves on the wrong side of outcomes they never anticipated. I wasn't threatening them. I was educating them. And the distinction mattered, because threats can be dismissed as bluster. Education demands engagement. It requires the listener to actually think. And as I talked, I watched their faces. Watched the confidence slowly, almost imperceptibly, begin to erode. Not because of anything I said that was overtly frightening. But because the fact that I was there, alone, calm, speaking clearly and without fear, started to raise possibilities they hadn't considered. If this man isn't afraid of us, what does he know? If he walked in here alone, what's waiting outside that we don't know about? If he's this calm, is it because he's foolish? Or is it because he has reason to feel safe that we can't see? Those questions, once they start, don't stop easily. By the fourth minute, the room had stopped being a room full of confident men. It had become a room full of men who were thinking. And thinking, in a group like that, is dangerous to the group's cohesion. Because shared belief systems require shared certainty. The moment individuals start thinking independently, start questioning, start running their own calculations about whether the group's assumptions are correct, the foundation starts to crack. I could see it happening. Some of them had stopped drinking. Some had straightened in their chairs. The body language in the room had shifted from relaxed arrogance to something tighter. More alert. More aware. Not afraid yet. But aware. And awareness is the first step toward fear. I kept talking. Kept it measured. Kept it calm. Kept bringing them back to the same central idea without ever stating it directly, that what they were planning would create consequences they hadn't fully considered. That the world they believed they controlled was smaller and more fragile than they thought. By the 6th minute, someone in the back of the room shifted uncomfortably. Someone else cleared his throat. Small movements. Small sounds. But in a room that had been filled with confident laughter 6 minutes earlier, they were enormous. The gray-haired leader hadn't spoken since his initial question. He was watching me. Studying me. Running his own calculations. And I could see the moment, around the 7th minute, when those calculations started producing answers he didn't want. The 8th minute was when everything changed. I stopped talking. Let the silence settle. Let it fill the room completely. Let every man in that basement feel the weight of it. Then I stood up straight. Adjusted my jacket. Looked around the room slowly. Not at everyone, at the leader. Because the leader was the foundation of this group's confidence. And if the foundation wavered, everything built on top of it would follow. You have a plan, I said. Simply. Factually. Not a question. He didn't confirm or deny it. But his eyes did. I'm here to tell you that the plan is finished, I said. Not because I'm going to stop you. Because you're going to stop yourselves. Because between now and the time you try to execute it, you're going to sit with what I've told you tonight. You're going to think about it. And when you think about it honestly, you're going to realize that proceeding with this plan means consequences that none of you are prepared for. I paused. Let that land. I'm not threatening you. I'm informing you. There's a difference. Threats give you something to push against. Information gives you something to think about. And thinking, for men like you, is usually where plans start to fall apart. I walked toward the stairs. Slowly. Deliberately. Back turned. Because turning my back on 15 men who hated everything I represented was the final statement. The final piece of the message. It said, I'm not afraid of what's behind me. And you should be afraid of what's in front of you. I didn't look back. Walked up those stairs with the same calm I'd walked down them. Left the building. Kept walking. Behind me, the room was silent. I know this because people told me afterward. Not just one person. Multiple people who had been in or near that building that night. The silence lasted a long time. Long enough that some of the men started looking at each other differently. Started seeing the confidence they'd shared as something more fragile than it had seemed an hour before. The plan they'd been developing for Harlem? It was never executed. Not because they were physically prevented. Because they chose not to proceed. Because between that night and whenever they might have carried it out, doubt crept in. Questions they couldn't answer started multiplying. And a group that operates on shared certainty cannot function once that certainty is compromised. They didn't fall apart overnight. That's not how it works. But the foundation had been damaged. The shared belief that kept them unified and confident had been questioned, publicly, by someone who had no business being able to question it. And once that happens, the cracks spread on their own. Word got back to Harlem within days. Not the full story, not all the details. Just the broad strokes. That Bumpy Johnson had walked into a KKK gathering alone. That he'd spent 8 minutes in that room. That the men had stopped laughing. That the plan had been abandoned. People reacted differently depending on who they were. Some were impressed. Some were skeptical. Some thought I'd been lucky. Some thought I'd been crazy. But everyone understood what it meant. It meant that the men who'd been terrorizing communities, who'd operated for years under the assumption that their numbers and their hatred made them unstoppable, had been confronted. Not by force. By presence. By the simple refusal to be afraid. Those 15 men were never seen the same way again. Not by me. Not by anyone who knew what happened in that basement. Because what I'd done that night wasn't just about me. Wasn't just about Bumpy Johnson walking into a dangerous room and walking out unchanged. It was about demonstrating something that undermined everything they'd built their identity on. They believed black people were beneath them. Believed their hatred was justified by some immutable order of things. Believed that their numbers and their organization and their shared purpose made them powerful beyond challenge. I showed them, in 8 minutes, that none of those beliefs held up under examination. That power built on shared delusion is only as strong as the delusion. And that all it takes is one person refusing to participate in the delusion to start its collapse. That's what 8 minutes of calm, calculated presence accomplished. Not violence. Not threats. Not dramatic confrontation. Just the truth. Delivered quietly. By someone who had every reason to be afraid and chose not to be. Years later, people ask me about that night. Want the dramatic details. Want to know if weapons were drawn. If fighting happened. If someone got hurt. Nothing like that occurred. And that's exactly the point. The most effective thing I've ever done in my life wasn't violent. It was psychological. It was walking into a room where I was outnumbered 15-1 and making every man in that room feel less certain about themselves than they had 5 minutes before. Because numbers don't equal power. I learned that early and confirmed it many times. Power is confidence. Power is certainty. Power is the unshakable belief that you know how the world works and your place in it. And all of those things can be undermined without a single weapon being raised. Without a single punch being thrown. Without anything more than presence, silence, and the willingness to force people to confront their own assumptions. That's what fear really is. Not the threat of violence. Not the awareness of danger. Fear is the moment you realize your certainty was wrong. The moment the world you thought you understood reveals itself to be different than you believed. I created that moment for 15 men in 8 minutes. And fear, once it changes sides like that, doesn't change back easily. The lesson I carry from that night isn't about courage. People think it was brave. Maybe it was. But bravery isn't what made it work. What made it work was understanding. Understanding how groups think. How shared belief systems function. How confidence can be undermined without force. How silence communicates more than words in certain situations. And understanding that the strongest move, the move that creates the most lasting change, is often the one that looks, from the outside, like the most vulnerable. Walking in alone. Unarmed. Into a room full of men who wanted to see you destroyed. That looked vulnerable. It was the opposite. It was the most powerful thing I could have done. Because it forced them to confront the one question their entire worldview couldn't answer. Why isn't he afraid? And once you start asking that question, you can't stop. You can't go back to the confidence you had before. Because the question implies an answer. And the answer, whatever they imagined it to be, had to involve something they hadn't accounted for. Something that made a single man walking into their space more dangerous than 15 men walking into his. That's what real power looks like when you strip away everything else. When you remove the weapons and the numbers and the noise. It looks like calm. It looks like certainty. It looks like someone who has already calculated every outcome and decided that none of them frighten him. The KKK members in that basement thought they were powerful because they were many. They learned, in 8 minutes, that many means nothing when the one person standing in front of you has already decided you can't hurt him. And that realization, that quiet, devastating realization, was worth more than any fight could have been. 8 minutes. 15 men. 1 room. And nobody laughed at the end.